It's a really, really interesting and difficult question, one that a lot of people are pondering over, and I have not yet seen a very convincing answer.
Are we seeing a bolder China in 2015? Will we see any benefit to the Asian central bank rate cuts? And what exactly is the global state of cybersecurity? These stories and more are coming up on the March 20th edition of Asia News Weekly. Well, hello everyone. I hope you're having a fantastic Friday. Welcome to this week's edition of Asia News Weekly. I, of course, am your host, Steve Miller, and thank you so much for taking time out of your week to join me here. Let's go ahead and get started with our very first story, and this has to deal with one of perhaps the biggest issues that I think is taking place in the region, and that, of course, is the South China Sea. Now, continuously, China uses the 9-dash line to assert its control over the area. This week, China's military, the world's largest, confirmed it was building a second aircraft carrier. And in the West Philippine Sea portion of the South China Sea, some estimate that China may have or is about to complete reclaiming 60 hectares of land from the disputed waters. Now, to help put everything into context, I'm inviting back onto the podcast Scott Harold, political scientist and deputy director for the Center of Asia-Pacific Policy at the RAND Corporation. Scott, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you.
China recently announced that it was increasing its military spending, starting construction on a second aircraft carrier, even went as far as to tell ASEAN member states that as a collective group, it has no business discussing territorial claims with China, and also came out and said that they have every right to build on reefs within the 9-dash line. So I have to ask you, are we seeing a bolder China in 2015?
Well, we're definitely seeing a bold China. China has been fairly assertive, some would even say aggressive in its actions over the last few years, and I think what we're seeing is a continuation of that policy. That policy is a change from the approach that we saw with China during the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s, when China's rise was characterized primarily by the slogan during the Hu Jintao years of seeking peaceful development in a harmonious world, and under the broadest category of policy directives, that being given by Deng Xiaoping, that urged China, as it grew stronger, to hide its capabilities and bide its time, or to avoid taking on too many responsibilities. What we're seeing, I think we saw a preview of during the immediate post-Olympics period, when the assertiveness first kicked up, and then again since 2013 when under Xi Jinping, is a China that's turning more towards trying to actively shape its security environment and the region that it lives in. And some of those are through setting up alternative or rival multilateral organizations, empowering ones that have already been in existence, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, building out new investment banks, and building up the BRICS investment bank also, building the maritime and on-land Silk Roads, i.e. the One Belt, One Road strategy that China has to reach out to the Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia. And then in the South China Sea, a real emphasis on trying to build facts on the water that will allow China to basically project power into the farthest southern and southeastern reaches of the South China Sea, so as to sustain and defend China's expansive territorial claims.
If we turn our attention to the Philippines, last year they took China to the Court of Arbitration in The Hague. This week, they dropped off another 3,000 pages to support their case. Unfortunately, China says that the court has absolutely no jurisdiction in this matter. So I have to ask you, when we're talking about the Philippines and other weaker ASEAN member states, do they have any avenues left to contest China's expansion into the South China Sea? Or do they simply have to sit back and let China have their way with all this territory?
It's a really, really interesting and difficult question, one that a lot of people are pondering over, and I have not yet seen a very convincing answer. So my comments will be purely speculative. Necessarily, the Philippines, since it does not have the material wherewithal to challenge China militarily on its claims, has fallen back on international law and the court system. China, unfortunately, has decided not to submit materials in support of its own claims, essentially deciding that force of arms and presence are going to trump international law. Now, if the court actually rules against China's claims, the real challenge will come at that point. Is China going to stand outside the system of international law and essentially flout the courts? If so, that would be damaging to international law. It would be destructive of China's soft power. But earlier, I want to pick up on a point that you asked, Steve, that I neglected to answer, and that was, what is ASEAN as a whole going to do? And I think the answer is ASEAN as a whole is going to do very, very little. And I think China knows that. ASEAN as a whole does not have very substantial decision-making power. It does not have a very strong collective identity. Countries that do not have, quote-unquote, a dog in the fight, in other words, landlocked countries like Laos, or countries that are very, very closely aligned to China and not involved in any territorial disputes with China, like Thailand and Cambodia, really don't have much interest in, awareness of, capacity to deal with the issue of China's South China Sea claims that overlap with Vietnam and the Philippines, and to some extent touch also on Malaysia, Brunei, and by furthest extension, Indonesia. ASEAN countries, generally speaking, view themselves as fairly small, fairly weak takers in the international system. They don't generally see themselves as having the capacity to shape the decisions of very, very large powers, especially very large nearby powers like China.
Scott Harold with the RAND Corporation, thank you so much for your time this week.
Absolutely, Steve. It's always a pleasure. Take care.
And coming up later in the podcast, what is the state of cybersecurity, not only in Asia, but the world? Last week, the central bank in South Korea slashed its interest rate. But you know what? It wasn't the only central bank within the Asia-Pacific region to do so. China, India, and Thailand all did the same thing. But what exactly does that mean for both you and for me? Well, to answer that question, I'm inviting back onto the podcast Curtis S. Chin. He's the inaugural Asia Fellow with the Milken Institute. Curtis, welcome back to the podcast.
Well, thank you. It's great to be back and to be on video, digital. It's not just you're hearing me, you're seeing me this time.
That's true.
Great to be here.
I have to ask you, South Korea,
Sure.
China, India, Thailand, they're all cutting their interest rates with the central bank. Why?
Well, I think it all comes down to what is any country going to try and do right now to increase their growth, and I think as even when we saw the United States some time ago, countries are seeking also to use monetary policy. So again, getting how do we get more money out into the economy? And one way they're doing it is through lowering rates and really trying to get people to think through, if we're not going to do all the other things that we really need to do to improve our economies, what is it that the government can do? And so banks right now, are indeed central banks. We're talking about central banks are lowering their interest rates. I think what will also be interesting, though, is when will the United States Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, start raising its rates?
Right, because that's been a discussion for a long time.
Absolutely. I think the reality is the world where even the United States, which is doing much better, or relatively better than other economies, we're still very much in this muddle through part of, our global economy, where countries are just really muddling along, in my view, because what they really need to do is more than lower interest rates or raise interest rates. I mean, really what they need to do is, again, focus on key structural reforms of their economy. That's the long-term solution. You can't use interest rates alone to improve your economy, to grow your economy, but certainly it can be part of it. And that's what I think all these countries are doing right now.
Right. So, I mean, the whole idea is that you lower the interest rates and that's going to help grow the economy. But when I was in the United States, we had the housing bubble burst and a lot of interest rates were cut way, way down for that. And I struggle to this day to think of any tangible benefits that I saw when the interest rates were cut by the Fed. Will you, myself, anyone just living here in Asia see any really direct benefit from these rate cuts?
Well, I would differ with you a little bit. Maybe in the long term it wasn't so good, but there were indeed certainly short-term benefits when in the United States, our country, the Federal Reserve lowered rates. How it works out with an economy. The Federal Reserve really, it's the rate that, let's say, banks would borrow. It's kind of a little bit simplistic about how banks would borrow. What do they pay? And then when their rates are lower, they can then make loans to, like you and I, if we wanted to buy a house, if we wanted to start a business, the interest rate that we would then get would be lower to reflect that overall rate. And so that's kind of the theory. So one way a country will try and grow its economy is, how do we get money to people to grow a business, to buy a home? And one way they'll do it is to get capital themselves. So traditionally, right now I'm lucky enough and have the honor to be the first Asia fellow of a group called the Milken Institute out of Los Angeles, really a dynamic group that focuses on many things, but one thing they're focused on is this notion of how do we innovate so that people can get capital to build a business. And one way, of course, is through lowering interest rates so that a bank will give me money. But we also need to think through about what are the other ways that countries can develop policies and encourage institutions that will provide money to you and me to start a business, to invest in some new equipment for our factory or whatever we might be doing. So I think that's part of the theory of what they're trying to do. But it can't just be one part. There's so much talk. One of the countries you mentioned was, I think, Japan. And so Japan, there's a lot of talk of something called Abenomics. Abe, of course, is the prime minister of Japan. And so this notion that Prime Minister Abe is going to change the Japanese economy, which has also been in the doldrums for quite some time, through a number of measures. One is fiscal stimulus, so let's get some money out there, do some projects. One is what you're talking about, almost easy money, so that the Bank of Japan will, again, lower interest rates, get money out there. But the third part of Abenomics, the third arrow they call it, referencing this kind of a folk tale about three arrows together being stronger than if they're individually, if you're trying to break these three arrows. If they're all together, you can't break them. So these three parts of his policy would also include reforms. And so I think, how we open up was talking about why are countries doing this. I think they're lowering their interest rates because it's the easy thing to do. But unfortunately, in my view and my experiences both in Asia and the United States, it can't be all that a country does if it really wants to grow the economy. So they're trying to lower these interest rates so that the banks, in theory, will then lend more to people to build businesses, to grow the economies. But the reality, if you're a business person, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a business person these days, it isn't just lower interest rates that will help me succeed in a country. It's what is the rule of law? Are we fighting corruption? What are all those other things that countries need to do here in Asia, but also back home in the United States, to encourage people to invest, to create jobs? And it can't just be lowered interest rates alone.
Right, those little bricks you were talking about when we last spoke.
Speaking regulation, intervention, corruption. We got to fight all those four things.
Fight the corruption. Speaking of central banks, now a lot of news has been about China's new development bank, the AIIB, and the United Kingdom just signed on to be part of that. So what, in short, is the takeaway from the UK joining that?
Well, that's probably a question best for the UK. I read some of the coverage of what they're saying. And for those who haven't really followed the story, less a central bank, this would be what we call a development bank. So these kind of government-owned banks that would help, fight poverty, help build infrastructure, certainly in Asia, but around the world for institutions like the World Bank. So the Chinese have put forth something called the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. I think it's called the AIIB in short. A bit of a rival, I think, to the World Bank and to the Asian Development Bank. And so when the Chinese announced this bank with great fanfare, they sought other countries to join. So all of Southeast Asia, the 10 nations of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, signed on. But really, in the beginnings of this, it hasn't really, started operations. It's all the signing ceremonies and all. None of the big Western countries, let's say Europe, the United States, and Australia out here, more Western oriented, did not sign on. And initially they were saying, it's not that we're opposed to it, because I think these banks are good if it encourages innovation, encourages competition. But there were concerns, and there still continue to be concerns about, will these banks simply give out money and not worry about the importance of protecting our environment, of safeguarding their, indigenous people, safeguarding people out there. So all these things called safeguards to protect people from what would be the unintended, bad consequences of some of these infrastructure banks. So indeed, the United Kingdom has indicated that they will sign on, and I saw some coverage from the Financial Times and others that the United States wasn't so happy. You have to ask them. I'm no longer in the U.S. government. But I think the UK's position, according to what I read, is that they believe by signing on in the beginning, they can have an influence in making sure that this AIIB will be effective and pay attention to these safeguards. I'm a little bit of a skeptic if the structure will be that the Chinese control 50% of the votes of this bank, which is what I've seen some of the articles right now. We'll see how it plays out. But I think that's been the big issue. So certainly, the United Kingdom, like the United States, will have to think through what's best for its own country. But hopefully all together we can figure out what's best for the countries that are going to borrow the money, and what can we do to both have infrastructure but do it in a way that makes sense for the people and for the environment. And I think that's the big concern about this AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank.
Curtis S. Chin, inaugural Asia Fellow with the Milken Institute. Thank you so much for joining me this week.
Hey, it's always great to be with you. Looking forward to be back on another show, another episode. Take care.
Absolutely. Well, there you have it. But you know what? Before I go, I'd love to hear from you. How is the economy treating you? Do you see signs of improvement, or are things getting worse? Please share your thoughts in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. Now, in just a few minutes, we'll also have some other stories from the region that you may have missed. Not too long ago, computer thieves were able to hack into banks around the world and steal $1 billion. That's right, $1 billion. And let us not forget, last year, allegedly, North Korea hacked into Sony Pictures. And even more recently, here in South Korea, cyber thieves were able to hack into the nation's nuclear reactors and then post their plans online. So you have to ask, why are we seeing these kinds of attacks more frequently? And more importantly, what's being done to stop them? For that, I'd like to invite on Lillian Ablon, a researcher with the RAND Corporation, to answer just that. Lillian, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Well, my first question is, we seem to be seeing an increase in the number of these large-scale hacking crimes. Is that truly the case, or is it merely perception?
We are seeing an increase in large-scale cyber attacks. It's a reality, but it's also a little bit of a perception. And let me go into that a little bit. There have been many cyber attacks in the past, ones that we may not have seen. So that's a perception piece. The reality piece comes where these big attacks happen and they get a lot of media attention. And so there's a lot more focus on them from the white hat world and the black hat world. And so those in the black hat world see the opportunity of these kinds of attacks and perhaps in some cases the gains they could make, especially in those cases where they're stealing financial data or personal health information or personally identifiable information. And so then they join in these kinds of forces or get into these kinds of situations where they want to get involved and they want to have more cyber attacks. So there is both the reality and the perception. And I would also add that we're seeing a shift from different sectors and opening up the floodgates of different sectors. So for example, we had Target back in December of 2013. And that was really one of the first big breaches in the retail sector that really got the media's attention. Now, that's actually not the biggest breach we've ever had on record in the retail sector. The honors of that go back to the attack on TJ Maxx and TJX Corporation years before that. Target really opened up the floodgates, and then almost immediately after that were attacks on things like Neiman Marcus, Staples, Michaels, PF Chains, Home Depot, and so on. And so that that's kind of one sector. We also had the financial sector, where there were attacks on JP Morgan Chase, and then, of course, recently the news of almost hundreds of millions, if not $1 billion worth of data stolen in the financial sector. And slowly we're shifting over to more attacks in the healthcare sector. So, for example, there was last August the attack on community health systems, and then just a few months ago the attack on Anthem, where 80 million pieces of personal information were stolen. So sector by sector is getting hit, and these attacks are increasing.
Are all cyber attacks the same?
There are distinctions in the types of cyber actors and cyber threats and who their targets are. So a lot of the times we say, boy, there's a lot of cyber attacks happening, but they're very different. The actors going after these attacks are different. Their motivations are different. And so even though we see something like Sony happening, I might not need to be as concerned about something like a Sony happening as I do a Target happening. So roughly there are 4 different kinds of cyber threat actors: state-sponsored actors, cyber criminals, hacktivists, and then cyber terrorists. And we kind of throw cyber terrorists in there because they are a category, but to date, there aren't what we would call cyber attacks or cyber terrorist attacks. But each of these groups is motivated by something different. So state-sponsored actors, they are forwarding the cause of their particular nation state or the political agenda of their particular nation state. And so the attack on Sony Pictures Entertainment would be a great example of state-sponsored actors. They want to exploit the systems, exfiltrate data, things like steal intellectual property, or conduct actual attacks to deny, degrade, disrupt, or destroy computers or networks or systems. Hacktivists really are motivated by a cause. They want to send a message. So things like leaking all the celebrity nudity from the iCloud hack from last year, or by taking down HB Gary, going after companies whose ideology they don't agree with. Now, cyber criminals, that's where we mostly talk about most of the attacks that happen in the news. These folks are motivated by financial gain. They want to make money. That's their sole purpose. Their sole motivation is to make money. And so these are attacks like Home Depot or Target or any kind of those retail sectors. And then that fourth group, which there haven't been cyber attacks or attacks via cyber means via terrorists, although they do live in cyberspace. They use the internet for a number of things like information gathering, learning how to build a bomb, or spreading out propaganda, or through website defacements, or hacking into Twitter accounts, or meeting or connecting or recruiting like-minded individuals. And so there's all these different attacks, all these different types of cyber threat actors. They have their own motivations. And so it's kind of important to separate out these different attackers and these different or cyber threat actors, because what each is going after is something different.
If we take a look at some of these big headline events, the $1 billion theft, the Sony hack, the arrest of 5 Chinese officials for hacking U.S. systems, are businesses and governments on the losing end of this cyber war?
Where we are now, the attackers are certainly outpacing the defenders. Now, the defenders are trying to, as much as they can, keep up or outmaneuver, outsmart the attackers. But we're in this constant cycle, this constant move, counter-move, cat-and-mouse game of, the attackers will use one sort of technique to get in or to do something. The defenders will counter that, which will then be countered by the attackers and so on. So the current state is bleak. The current state is a defensive, reactionary mode. It's very much a patch and pray, wait and see what happens.
And in your opinion, what needs to be done to better protect these systems?
So I think for each of these systems or each of the groups, government, military, commercial, civil, what needs to happen first is essentially a risk assessment to see who are the cyber threat actors that are going after them. What are the vulnerabilities that particular group might have, that particular government or commercial group might have, and then what might be the impact? Because one would need to defend differently against a state-sponsored actor than they would against a cyber criminal or a hacktivist. So there's not kind of a blanket, this is the one thing, if everyone did this one thing, then we would be all secure. Unfortunately, there's not a silver bullet in cyberspace. although there are different levels of sophistication for different cyber actors, the best that you can do is to make it hard, to drain the resources of the cyber threat, to make it costly in terms of time and money and resources and attention, and make it so only the very most determined and sophisticated adversary gets to you. And there's a number of things you can do in order to do that. Defense in depth is one of the solutions that gets proposed. Better attribution, better detection, moving away from signature-based to anomaly-based. We're still in the very nascent stage, or technologies are still in the very nascent stage of having good anomaly detection or behavior-based detection of network traffic. There's really no one solution, and the best you can do is, if you've heard that old analogy of you and a friend are running away from a bear, you don't have to outrun the bear, you just have to outrun your friend for the most case.
Lillian Ablon is a researcher with the RAND Corporation. Thank you so much for your time this week.
Oh, absolutely. It was a pleasure.
And now I'd like to hear from you. What do you think? Are governments, are businesses doing enough to protect your data? Please chime in and let me know. And don't forget, we also have another podcast. It's called Asia Now. It's released every Wednesday and features stories and interviews from the Asia Pacific region. This week, I had Dr. Bruce Bennett on from the RAND Corporation, who discusses what exactly is going on in North Korea. It's a great podcast, so if you're interested in the region, be sure to check it out. And now for a quick look at other regional news that I think you should be keeping an eye on. First up, from the Maldives. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights says there were flagrant irregularities with the trial of former Maldives President Mohamed Nasheed. Nasheed was ousted in 2012 following what he says was a coup and has been sentenced to 13 years on terrorism charges. Zaid Ra'ad Al Hussein said the trial appears to contravene the Maldives' own laws and practices and international fair trial standards in a number of respects. Maldives Foreign Minister Dahuna Malmoon countered the trial was conducted in accordance with the relevant laws and criminal procedures prevailing in the Maldives. Due process was followed. Now, keep in mind that Nasheed won his election back in 2008, ending about 30 years of rule by Maumoon Abdul Gayoom, who just happens to be the half-brother of the current president in the Maldives. Talk about things that make you go, Now, Thai lawyers say that their suspects may have been tortured while in police custody. A group of lawyers asked for a formal investigation into claims 4 suspects held in the Bangkok bomb attack were tortured. This comes as concerns grow about the use of force employed by the junta to exert control. A total of 13 people were arrested in connection with the blast. The suspects were kicked in the back. Some said they were electrocuted during questioning between March 9th and March 15th, the group said in a statement. The overall human rights issue in Thailand right now is of great concern after the junta took control. That's why next week on Wednesday's Asia Now podcast, I'll be joined by Phil Robertson from Human Rights Watch. We'll not only tackle the issue of human rights within Thailand, but throughout the region as well. And moving on to fighting continuing in the Kokon region of Burma. Rebels say the military has launched an intensive campaign, and as many as 160 rebels have been killed or wounded. Burma says that only 2 of its soldiers were killed and 5 wounded. They have also purportedly offered $11,000 in compensation to the families of Chinese citizens killed in an errant attack on their side of the border. Now, this fighting dates back to early February, when several rebel groups banded together to try and retake territory that they had once lost. China is also very worried about the situation because they say as many as 30,000 people from Burma have crossed into the southern Yunnan province. Now, Burmese officials also say that the rebels may be getting help from somebody on the Chinese side of the border. So keep an eye out on this. This could quickly spiral out of control. Switching gears, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe from Japan had some words for the United Nations, and he called for immediate reforms to the UN Security Council. He said now was the time to produce concrete results rather than spending time on talks. He then made the case to make Japan a permanent member of the council. Now, personally, I don't believe that adding Japan or any other country to the permanent membership of the Security Council is going to make any difference. What I do believe needs to happen is that the members of the Security Council need to have their veto votes taken away. I think the whole implementation of the veto vote system just allows for political maneuvering behind the scenes rather than the intention of that Security Council to actually implement change. The vetoes need to go. And finally, the United Nations has confirmed that 24 people have perished in Vanuatu from Cyclone Pam. Aid agencies say this is among the most challenging of circumstances they have ever faced. The capital of Port Vila now has access to water and partial electrical power. And that's unfortunately about the best news regarding this situation. Just goes to show you that they have a lot of work left to do. All right, my friends, here we are at the end of the podcast. And before I get to your comments, which, by the way, were absolutely awesome this week, I want to ask you for some feedback. I made some changes to the podcast last week and again this week, and I'd like to hear from you. If you're watching the podcast on YouTube, how do you like the visuals? Do you like this video presentation? Make sure you leave a comment or shoot me an email. I definitely want to hear from you. If you only listen to the podcast via iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, SoundCloud, also let me know if you like the style of the podcast. I make this for you, so I want to deliver the best possible product that I can. So please shoot me an email, drop me a comment, hit me up on Facebook or Twitter. I want to hear from you. All right, let's get to your comments. First up, from the article I shared about a Korean professor accused of sexual harassment, Anna Park says, 2 girls are sentenced to 3 years in prison for blackmailing a famous actor, and a man gets nothing for sexual abuse. Tisk tisk. Former Arirang anchor and current KMBC9 and Kansas City newsman Scott Thompson says, absolutely reprehensible. Students should walk out, stage a sit-in until that professor is given the boot for good. William George on last week's Asian News Weekly podcast says, they should lower the voting age to 12. Speaking of Japan, they won't vote anyway, so the status quo will stay. Stephen Levy of the Korean Underground podcast spoke on the differing views between older and younger generations regarding the Lippert attack. The Koreans in my discussion group today all thought the reaction by some Koreans was totally off the wall. I think they were more embarrassed by the actions of the people camping out in front of the hospital and doing fan dances than by the incident itself. Perdomont on the Asia Brief wrote, those rapists in India need to be caught. The comfort woman issue has been going on long before Abe was elected and will continue. The Korean government misused the money, and it's up to them to pay the survivors and inform their populace. The apology aspect is just an attempt to humiliate Japan, and the current generation have no responsibility towards what happened 70 plus years ago. It's holding on to these foolish things that prevents the Asian countries from dealing with the threat from communist China and North Korea. There are real threats in the world today, and they need to be dealt with. Red White Dude also on the Asia Brief said, the problem with Japan is that the right has too much influence in the government. If Abe tries to apologize, he will be out. I think the problem with Korea is that if Japan does apologize, then the Koreans can move forward with what was done with compensation. But they are too fixated with the apology part, hence they do not question or explore what happened with the money. And finally, Ray Munakata, regarding Abe petitioning Japan to join the UN Security Council as a permanent member. Abe's words in the end, Japan, proud of its concrete achievements, is ready to play a role as a Security Council permanent member, sounds like Japan is arrogant. It's been already 70 years after the war is over and the launch of the United Nations with the Security Council. Power balance of this world remarkably changed. It's not only Japan, but also other non-permanent members of the Security Council should join the Council with equal rights to the 5 permanent members. Abe's got to be careful with words. All the UN needs is to get rid of the boundary between permanent and non-permanent members. Again, those were absolutely amazing comments. Thank you so much for taking the time to write them. And again, this week, if you have some thoughts about the stories in this week's podcast, please take a moment, leave your thoughts in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. Be sure to follow Asian News Weekly on Facebook or Twitter for more news from the region. If you have any comments, questions, or feedback from the show, I definitely want to hear from you. The email address is podcast@asiannewsweekly.net. If you enjoyed the program, please share it with your friends, and if you haven't, subscribe. It's absolutely free, and when you do, the next episode is delivered automatically to you. You can do that here, you can do it on our website, asiannewsweekly.net. You can even do it in your favorite podcast application, like iTunes or Stitcher. I will be back on Monday morning with the Asia Brief, but until then, I hope you have an amazing weekend. My name is Steve Miller, reminding you to be true to yourself and to always be awesome.